Okay, so I guess I'm gonna start. Hey,
Yes.
thank you for coming.
Tell us about yourself.
So
a little bit.
I am a real estate agent with eXp Realty, just like many of you are. I started about 8 years ago, and I got into multi-family homes, mainly from doing rentals in those multi-family homes at first. And then those rentals turned to listings, and they turned to sales, because if you do right by the landlord, they'll come back to you. And that is how I got into that business pretty much. And then I just started to prospect those properties. So it's like I didn't settle for what I got. I went for what I wanted, pretty much. And I love multifamily property, and nothing to do with the price point. I just love multifamily property.
Why do you like it versus
Sure.
a single family house?
Because it's an investment vehicle, and it gives you a return. And I've always loved investing, and I love the stock market. So this helped me combine numbers with real estate.
So less of an emotional process,
Yes,
more of a
yes, absolutely.
business transaction. Cool.
Yes, I don't want to say it out loud, but I'm not a fan of working with first-time home buyers. It's way too emotional.
I don't do it.
I don't want to sell you something on the color of the living room. I want to sell you on the money that it's going to produce.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just some people love first-time home buyers.
Yeah.
I do, but I see your point and I love that point too.
Investors can be very brutal though. So
Right, they're ruthless.
you
They
cannot
no
have any
heart.
feelings. Like
Yeah.
so like I cannot have any feelings either, pretty much. And there's many times they'll crush your heart, and they'll go and you can show them the property, and they'll go put the offer in with the listing agent. First-time home buyers are much less likely to do that. They are much more likely to do that, but it's more of like a listing game with multifamily, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so with the show of hands, can I please see who is here because they want to buy multifamily property? Okay, and also agents that want to sell more multifamily property. Awesome, it's about the same amount of hands. All right, so hopefully something I say today is going to help you guys achieve both of those goals. So today we're going to start with just learning about the landscape of New York City multifamily properties. What is it made up of? So we have residential, which is 2 to 4 family. It's a very standard property. You see it all over New York City, mainly in Brooklyn and Queens. We have the 5+ family residential commercial. And the reason why I say residential commercial and not just commercial is because commercial goes into 2 parts. We have the strictly commercial office towers and warehouses, which we have to separate from the residential units that are also commercial property. Okay? So we're going to only focus on residential units. And also we have mixed use, which has residential units, but that's strictly commercial. So we're in a mixed use building right now. Okay. So any questions about this? Okay. So what are the types of New York City rental units? They fall into 3 categories. You have rent controlled, rent stabilized, and free market. They're not the same thing and have a big impact on the valuation and desirability of your multifamily property. So what is the difference? Can someone tell me the difference between rent controlled and rent stabilized?
Let's go through that.
Does someone, if anyone knows, so that's why I want to see like how much
No,
value
I
I'm bringing to
never
the room.
understood the difference between those two.
Okay,
And
that's why.
until now I don't get it.
Okay. That's what I'm gonna stay because I think
Yes.
I'm gonna stir that.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So let's start with rent control. There's a big difference. So rent controlled are units located in 6+ apartment buildings, 6+ units that were built prior to 1947. For the unit to be under rent control, the tenant must have been residing there continuously since July 1st, 1971. This is the rare one. The rent can be raised up to 7.5% every 2 years, but cannot exceed a maximum base rent, which is determined per unit and is only raised to the extent of covering the landlord's maintenance costs. So it's pretty much not for profit, pretty much. This number is determined by the Rent Guidelines Board. A landlord must file for and show cause for need in increased rent. The rent is not increased automatically every 1 to 2 years, as it is with rent stabilized properties. Rent controlled apartments can be inherited by family as long as the heir to the apartment has been living in the apartment for at least 2 years before the death or permanent relocation of the former tenant. there are no new rent control leases being written. Once the rent control tenant passes away or moves, the unit becomes rent stabilized. There are currently only 16,400 rent controlled apartments left in New York City. They're literally dying out. Okay, so this is the really, really rare one. If somebody has a family member that has a rent controlled apartment, you hear about this in the news sometimes, that's facing Central Park and they're paying $400 a month. That's rent control, that's not rent stabilized. There are very, very few of these left. So rent stabilized is the very common one that we have all over the place. So rent stabilized are the units generally found also in 6+ unit commercial buildings, with some exceptions, which were built prior to 1974, which are not in co-op or condo buildings. Although a rent stabilized tenant who moved into such a building prior to co-op or condo conversion would still be protected under rent stabilization. The increases on leases for rent stabilized tenants is determined annually by the Rent Guidelines Board. That's the one you see on the news. And they say we came out with like a 1% increase or a 2% increase. That's the Rent Guidelines Board. And that's only for rent stabilized units, not for rent controlled units. A rent stabilized tenant is entitled to a rent stabilized lease. Initially when the apartment is rented, and a lease renewal of either 1 or 2 years at the choice of the tenant thereafter. Family members of rent stabilized tenants have the right to inherit the lease if they've been residing in the apartment for at least 2 years as well. There are currently 1,048,000 rent stabilized apartments in New York City. So this is the very common one that's surrounding.
1 million.
Yeah, a lot. And there used to be more, because they've been deregulated.
And they all market rent now.
Yeah. If they didn't pass 2019, we would have had way less right now.
Yeah.
Okay, and yes, question.
Is the relatives of those tenants, do they need permission from the landlord, or they can just?
No, it's their right. It's called succession rights. They just have to show, they have to either be, they have to show proof that they were there for 2 years. So for a rent controlled tenant, it would be something like a driver's license or like registration or something, that was their address. For a rent stabilized tenant, they would have to be on the lease for at least 2 years. If the person there's one loophole, if the person is over 62 years old, they have to live there for at least 1 year, not 2 years. That's the only loophole, if they're a senior citizen.
But it's still up to the tenant, there is no way if the landlord wants them to go.
Can't, it's a right. It's very, very well enforced, yeah. That's why people are holding on to the apartments. And some are claiming their family when they weren't. Because they have to prove it, especially if you're rent controlled, property management or the ownership is not gonna, they will vet everything to make sure you're really family.
So what's the advantage for the landlord to have those rent stabilized apartments?
There is no advantage. If they didn't want to have them, they would gladly destroy all of them. There is no advantage. Well, we'll see. There are actually loopholes that they had to go through to destabilize them that they took away. And we'll go through those loopholes. And the only thing that's left. And then we have free market. This is the most desirable unit to have in property. Most desirable and valuable of New York City's multifamily property investments from a standpoint of valuation, flexibility, and owner's control. Free market units are found in any building which has less than 6 units, so the smaller ones. Some exceptions do apply. And in buildings of any size built after 1973. The owner of a free market apartment or building can set rents to what the renter is willing to pay for the unit. So it's free market pretty much. The owner also has the right to not renew a lease or offer a month-to-month rental agreement instead. Free market apartments can also exist in rent-stabilized buildings, which became deregulated prior to the enactment of the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019, an act which eliminated many paths or loopholes for owners to legally deregulate rent-stabilized apartments. This legal overhaul caused the value of rent-stabilized buildings to plummet by up to 30% overnight. Okay. Any questions? Do you want to know why those buildings plummeted 30% overnight?
Sure, why not?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, because of basically the new rules in place where you're not able to, like raise the rents as much as you wanted as far as market rent, which hence brings the value down to investors because they're not going to have as much return. I'm trying to simplify, as much return. So therefore, the property doesn't have as much value in their eyes. And we've seen, what people would expect to sell at a $1.7 million in 2018. For instance, now if you have $1.2 million, it's barely what you're gonna get.
Talk about six family?
Six family.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a very good example of six family.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So as you were asking, why do landlords want them? They don't. They don't want them to such a point that once they realize that they can no longer have a loophole to deregulate them,
Yeah.
the prices plummeted. Those buildings no longer became desirable.
Yeah.
So they really don't. The law is forcing them to keep those.
We had a potential seller who was having the, I think it was 12 units building.
Yeah.
Close to the Central Park. She was not able to sell it because one tenant stayed. And she was constantly suing him.
Was she stabilized, rent stabilized?
She didn't stabilize, so she was, but at the end, I think he sold it at 6 million instead of 12
Yes.
that he was
Wow.
thinking. Because of that
Could
tenant.
make a huge
She
difference.
wasn't like already in plus, she was suing him every time,
Yep.
harassment, for this, for that.
Yeah. It can be a nightmare, especially if they know their rights. Their rights are very strictly enforced, especially a rent control tenant. Okay. So what are the popular pre-2019 destabilization loopholes? There were actually many loopholes. But the most popular one that landlords love to use is called high rent decontrol. What that meant is once the legal rent passed this threshold for these years in New York City, the apartment automatically became destabilized and it became a free market apartment. And it didn't matter how many units were in the building, when the building was built. So this was a major loophole that a lot of them used. They just kept pushing up the rates and raising it. Then we also had luxury decontrol. A lot of people didn't know this, that luxury decontrol pretty much meant that if you were able to get a tenant in your rent stabilized apartment who made more than $200,000 a year for the whole household, that apartment automatically became destabilized as well. So that's why a lot of them were looking for people who made a lot of money, pretty much. And then this was a really, really easy way to get decontrol, was major capital improvements, or MCI. That's why you saw a lot of those buildings were bought out and totally gutted, and a lot of money was put into them to renovate the units. It's not because they wanted to spend that money, but if they did spend that money, it was a loophole. So this MCI provided incentives for landlords to rehab rent-regulated apartments in exchange for an increase in the base legal rent of the apartment. This amount was usually a 1/40th monthly rent increase from the total amount spent on renovating the unit. So here's an example. Pre-2019, if an apartment's legal rent, say in 2017, was $1,850 a month, it's a rent-stabilized apartment, and the owners spent $40,000 on renovating the apartment, which is about the average cost. Renovating the vacant apartment, $40,000 gets divided by 40, it's 1/40th, that's $1,000 increase to the base rent legally. The new rent then became $2,850, $1,850 plus 1,000, and the apartment became deregulated. It was pushed above the threshold. So that's why a lot of them were totally gutted. And after they were gutted, they were sold. They would buy a six family for 1.5. They would totally gut and deregulate the whole building, and then they would sell for $3 to $3.5 million.
But that's only if it's renovated, right? What if it's not renovated?
Sure.
They
It's not.
still want it to 2,500, for example. Sorry to interrupt. I know there's a landlord that all their tenants, they're like 500, 600 tenants because they've been there for more than 15 years.
Sure.
And he has one apartment available. He has done any renovation. He's renting it for 2,500. I'm sorry, 2,600.
These loopholes no longer exist. That's what I'm trying to. So this is pre-2019.
Yeah.
A lot of landlords didn't know about these loopholes. A lot of those mom and pop landlords, they didn't know about this. So this is mainly savvy investors who went into these neighborhoods and bought out the buildings. And that's why they love vacant buildings. If they were rent stabilized and vacant, or majority vacant, they can easily go in there without having to either evict tenants. It's very hard to evict a rent stabilized tenant if they're paying rent.
And then on top of it, all the rental laws in New York State as of May 2019 became a lot more, even more favorable towards tenants than they were ever before, which made even the matter worse. you know?
Brutally favorable.
Yes, brutally.
If you're a rent stabilized tenant, like you can get away with murder, pretty much.
Yeah,
Even if you don't pay rent, like it'll take 3 years to evict you, bro.
exactly.
Yeah, especially after COVID. Yeah, because right now the court cases they're so backed up.
Backed
they're
up, yes,
like
no,
2-3 years backed up, and they're pretty much listening to like the free market apartments, so like getting evicted first because they have no protection. Rent stabilized tenants, they're gonna go last. I mean, yes.
Do you think eventually, because tenants have so many rights and it's not fair to the landlord, do you think eventually something will happen where, I mean, because these tenants get away with
Yeah.
so much, and investors, they're losing out.
Yeah.
You know, so what do you think about that? What's your opinion?
So it has a lot to do with politics and the city's leadership. So
And the state?
yes, a lot to do with the mayor and the governor. So when we previously had in the 90s, I believe in 96, when we had he actually passed one of the most pro landlord laws, which actually made a lot of these loopholes possible, but now they took them away. So it pretty much, it has to do with, so they don't care about the landlord because the landlords are not what getting them elected. There are very few landlords, there are very many tenants. Okay, so they're fighting for your vote, and they will do whatever you want for your vote.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes no political sense for them to fight someone who's not going to vote for them anyway, right? Okay.
And it's even beyond political affiliation at this point. It's just politics.
Yeah, it's just do you want to get elected or not
Yeah.
in New York City? And if you do, there's no
Yeah.
way you're going to protect the landlord. It makes no. It's political suicide to do that. So yes, they are killing the valuation of the properties, but we'll see why it's still good to buy in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
So are there any legal loopholes left to deregulate an apartment? Yes, there's one. There's one left, and it's called apartment breaking. So breaking is when you combine two rent stabilized apartments either next to each other or above and below and create one larger new apartment. So it's a very tough loophole though.
But
Yeah.
how can you break it if there is a tenant, for example, living?
It has to be vacant. That's the thing. So both of them have to be vacant at the same time. And since what you're doing is you're hacking the system, so you're pretty much eliminating two previously rent stabilized apartments. You're making it into one
Okay.
new apartment, which has no history of rent stabilization with DHCR, which is who you register. So it falls out of their purview pretty much. So it's like you're giving birth to a new apartment. It's a hack, you know. It's really cool. But they used to do this before. Well, before it was done very, very rarely because it's very expensive to do because you need architectural drawings and you need DOB permits. Before they would just renovate the apartment and re-rent it.
That's so bad.
So that's it. The breaking only makes sense in the city, like in very expensive neighborhoods, where if you combine two rent stabilized apartments that are $1,500 each, let's say, instead of getting $3,000, you can now get $7,000 for it. Out in Queens, you can't really get that much of a difference, so it doesn't really make sense to break the apartment. So the key city agencies and their roles. So Division of Housing and Community Renewal, which is DHCR, it's a state agency that has its primary responsibility is to formulate New York State housing policy and enforce the provisions of the state's residential rent regulation laws. So they're pretty much the enforcement arm of all these laws. They're the ones who enforce it, which ensure landlords don't overcharge rent stabilized and rent controlled tenants, and supply tenants with adequate utilities and provide a habitable environment, amongst other things. A landlord found to be illegally overcharging a rent-regulated tenant can be held to treble damages. In short, the landlord will be forced to repay 3 times the amount they overcharged the tenant during the entire tenancy period. Okay. So sometimes people think, well, why can't the landlord just rent it out at the price they want? You know, this is the reason why. Because if your tenant finds out what the legal rent is in there, they report you to DHCR, you can have to pay trouble damages, which is you're gonna have to pay back whatever you overcharged times 3 back to the tenant over as many years as the tenant has been overcharged. So there's very, very stiff penalties for this. Yeah, this is why landlords don't do it. Some do, but they won't. And we have the rent guidelines board. This is the board that so what they do is they mandate established rent adjustments for the approximately 1 million dwelling units subject to rent stabilization law. So this is only for rent stabilization, not rent control. So factors they consider every year are projected real estate taxes, sewer and water rates, gross operating and maintenance costs, including insurance rates, cost of fuel, labor costs, and overall supply of housing availability and vacancy rates. The board holds annual series of public meetings and hearings to consider research from staff and testimony from owners, tenants, advocacy groups, and industry experts. So it's pretty much a public forum that you see on the news, how whatever they decide how many percent they're gonna raise it this year for 1 year and 2 year leases. That's their job, that's the rent guidelines board. Oh, any questions? All right, so next, how do you protect yourself from purchasing, now we're gonna go into purchasing. How do you protect yourself from purchasing a property that the landlord has been for many, many years incorrectly or not even reporting the rents, pretty much? And how do you know that they're actually rent controlled or rent stabilized or free market? Because there are landlords out there who are selling a building and they're tell you, oh, only one apartment is rent controlled or rent stabilized. Meanwhile, all of them except one are rent stabilized. So how do you find out? There's actually a way, and the only way to do this is to put in a records request from DHCR. This is, it's a free records request, yeah, you have to fill it out. You go to hcr.ny.gov. It's a fillable PDF, you could fill it out to PDF, and you can actually email it to them. You no longer have to mail it to them. So this is part of due diligence for both buyers and listing agents, okay? So you don't want to purchase someone else's mess, okay? So due diligence is your best friend when buying or brokering rent-regulated multifamily. Be sure to file for a records request with DHCR when considering purchasing a rent-regulated multifamily property to ensure the current owner has correctly filed all previous year's leases and to ensure the legal rents that they are charging are the actual rents that the owner is currently charging the tenants. So you want those amounts to match up pretty much. Because the owner's gonna give you one set of rent roll, and you wanna do your own research and make sure that rent roll matches up with this. Because if that owner has been overcharging those tenants for years and you buy the property, those treble damages could become your problem now. Okay? So, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, you're not gonna go look for the other owner. Someone is gonna pay for it. So, and then also, when you're listing a rent-regulated property for sale, listing agents are strongly encouraged to do the same. Marketing inaccurate rental information and rent rolls, even unknowingly, can land a listing agent in hot water for misrepresenting, right? So if there was a buyer, if you were the listing agent, let's say, and you got the rent roll solely depending on what the owner told you, in good faith, and that's what you marketed, and there was a buyer that came along and took your word for it, that those were the rents they're paying, the property sold, and one of the tenants finds out they were overcharged, and they came back 2 years later, and then the landlord finds out that he was overcharging them as well, since he bought the building. So now they filed a complaint, they're gonna go back all those years, and they can very well hold that new owner accountable, and guess he's gonna come after? Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. It's not coming out of his
Don't
pocket.
they have a attorney to verify all this information?
Most lawyers don't. You'd be very surprised. I mean, New York is a buyer beware state. I mean, attorney's job is mainly to verify like HPD violations and stuff like that, to verify rent rolls, because this can literally take up to 2 months to come back to you, like this request. It really can.
So we need to email to that and ask
Yeah.
for the records, right?
Yeah, I'll show you.
And then
what
how
comes-
much is that? Is it free?
It's free. It's a records request. And this is what they'll send back. This is a request that I did for a Swiss family. And you see, it literally says everything. And you can request for as many years back as you want. So it says every apartment, rent, I see all of them are RS, rent stabilized, what the legal rent is, what the preferential rate they're charging, the actual rent they're paying, and the date the owner filed. So this owner was on top of the filings. When the lease began, most of them are 2-year leases. Most rent stabilized tenants do elect 2-year leases. And when lease ends. So this all checks out. So luckily they got back to me pretty quick within a week. And so I waited until I got this before I told anyone what the rents are. And you literally, if you want any sensitive information, block it out with tenants' names. But if they ask you for the rent roll, just send them this. You know, don't even make your own thing. Directly from the horse's mouth, pretty much. Like this is DHCR's rent roll, this is the rent roll for the building. That way there's no way you can be held legally liable for any kind of wrongdoing. I think the longer you do this, the more your business just goes to like protecting yourself. Because you just see so much nonsense.
But this only applies to 6 family, right? Because-
Everything that's rent
But a
stabilized.
2-family house, like.
No, but that's not rent stabilized.
Okay,
This is only for DHCR control,
okay.
which is rent stabilized or rent controlled.
Isn't that usually 6 family and or more?
So you can request it for a 20-unit building or a 12-unit building. You just have a lot more names on there. So this just had 6 because it's one I had to make an example of. Okay, so next, how else can you protect yourself? This is called a tenant estoppel certificate. Most of us have just heard this in real estate school and never have actually used it. I know we've all heard it, but this is actually extremely important.
I have one on me right now.
There you go.
I
There you go.
remember we touched that.
Yeah, tenant, like this is people don't, yeah, they just pass it by. So tenant estoppel certificates or TCs, they're not required, but these are mostly used for like the 2 families or the 3 families or the 4 families, where you cannot reach out to DHCR and see if the tenants, how much they're paying, or are they up to date on their payments, or how much deposit is the owner actually holding when they're transferring. Because the buyer never actually communicates to the tenants when he's going through the purchase process. He communicates to the agent, right? The agent communicates with the owner. So the buyer has no way to actually speak to the tenants and make sure that the security deposits, let's say he's getting, are the actual ones this owner is holding. Because before there were some owners that would hold 3-month security deposit, right? From tenants that moved in 5 years ago. But he can only say, I'm only holding 1 month and pocket the other 2 months. And by the time the new owner finds out, that old owner is gone. And let's say the old tenant is gonna move out now, and they're gonna say, well, the other landlord had 3 months deposit. Well, they only told me 1 month. So that, but the deposit gets transferred to the new owner, so the new owner is expected to pay that money when that tenant moves out. So this pretty much establishes a set of facts. So that each tenant, not every tenant is gonna sign it, but if they do that's great. So it pretty much tells you when their lease, like if they're on a month to month, if they have a lease, it tells you if they have any claims against the current landlord, if they're in court with a current landlord. So this says that they don't hold them liable for anything, because you're taking over that problem now, if you don't know about those things. So what is the statement signed by tenant certifying facts about the lease or rental agreement and the business relationship between the tenant and landlord. The tenant certifies that they have no claim against the current landlord, because that claim can go over to you as a new owner. The amount of deposit the current landlord holds, and that they're up to date on all rent payments, amongst other things. So once the tenant signs and certifies this, it prevents them from later claiming a different set of facts. So that would prevent them from saying, oh, that guy had 3 months of my deposit, you have to give me 3 months, because they signed to have 1 month. Right? So it solidifies that relationship. Does anyone? I know people have questions about this, so just.
How often do you get this signed?
How often? Not.
Signing that.
I'll tell you how often. If the buyer or the buyer's attorney requested.
Okay.
So there are some, like for instance, this deal, the buyer's attorney did request it. It was a 4-family, and luckily the great relationship with them, all 4 tenants signed it.
Cool.
But there are many that won't sign this. That's why it's very important to have good relationships with. And there was one tenant that was on the brink of not signing it. She wanted to like share it with a family member. She didn't know what it was. And the guy started having questions about it. He's like, well, why isn't she signing it? is she not paying rent? There were all these questions, come up. And then luckily she signed it. So there was no issue there. So that could be the biggest pitfall in New York City. Unknowingly purchasing a property with non-performing tenants is one of the biggest pitfalls an investor can make, especially in New York City, as evicting a non-paying tenant can take up to a year or longer. Now it's taking longer. That's a problem you don't want to inherit from a previous landlord. This can cost landlords thousands in lost rent, legal fees, and months of headaches right off the bat. So many times, if an investment deal looks too good to be true, usually is. A non-paying tenant or squatters may be the reason why. The current owner likely just wants out of the messy situation and is willing to dump the property for less than market rate. So be sure to vet the seller by asking for 6 to 12 months of rent deposits from each tenant into their bank's account, their business account or personal, or copies of rent checks from each tenant you will inherit. So if they're staying there, you want to make sure that they're up to date pretty much. If they're moving, as long as they're out, you don't really care. As long as they're out in the final walkthrough.
This is if you're buying.
Yes. This is how to protect yourself or your buyer. Like,
What if you're the agent and taking that listing, like what type of questions you need to ask?
you just ask, so are these? You just ask, are all the tenants up to date on their rent? Are all the tenants up to date on their rent? Usually a landlord will share that with a listing agent because they know it's gonna come out sooner or later. Other than that, as the listing agent, you have a duty to disclose, but you don't really have much more than that, unless you know something. With tenants, you're not really required to disclose much with tenants. This is more if you're the buyer's agent, or if you're the actual buyer. This is just stuff to watch out for. Any other questions? Abe, you have a question?
No.
Eddie?
I remember I took one listing and it was a woman living in the apartment. The seller, he told me that, oh, she's so elderly, he was waiting actually for like 12 years. And she was still
This is the 12 family?
buying. No, it was just
Oh, this is
apartment.
different. Okay.
And then we put it on the market, and then the buyers, basically they find out that the woman is like 50 years old. So it would be probably much longer lease than they expected. That's why I'm asking like what the right questions to ask the seller. He told us legally different information.
Yeah, that's a little different. So he lied about the age of the tenant? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, he's like, it's not gonna, she doesn't have a family, and she's like elderly, but she was like pretty young. And she had a family, who's definitely gonna inherit the lease further.
I see. Okay, so was it a co-op that was
a
leased?
co-op.
Was it a sublease? Or was it?
It was rent occupied apartment.
Got it. So okay, I see what you're saying. You can't make a guarantee there to the seller. You can't, like, either he wants to deliver vacant or either the buyer wants it vacant or they don't. So if they want it vacant, can it be done at the walkthrough? If it can, then that's going to be stipulated in the contract. If not, I wouldn't really say, because if the buyer is buying the apartment occupied, they should pretty much be ready to have it occupied for a month or 10 years, because we cannot make those guarantees.
Yeah.
If he wants that guarantee, go buy either a vacant apartment or one that's going to be delivered vacant. Like that's really what I would tell a buyer. I mean, there's plenty of those. There's plenty of vacant apartments. But yeah, that is a great point though. Thank you for asking that. So why would anyone want to invest in New York City? It's so terrible. So, oh my God, I don't know what's happening. Doesn't.
It's working out.
So the biggest one is land scarcity. Okay. So most of the metropolitan cities or large cities are expanding outwards. New York City has almost no more developable land left within its boundaries. New buildings are very expensive to build here and very complex to obtain building approval for. This will continue to keep rental housing stock at a lower growth rate than the rate of demand from renters. Okay? And also the fact that we have 1 million rent-stabilized apartments, that can be seen as a negative, but it can also be seen as a positive. Because rent-stabilized tenants don't just get up and move very often. So those million apartments are always occupied for new people coming in. So if that stock is off the market, people are not moving in and out, pretty much what's left is the free market apartments. And that's the reason why our free market apartments are so expensive. Because we have 1 million apartments that are occupied by people who otherwise would have got up and left if they had to pay market rate rent. So one can argue that if we get rid of rent stabilization and make everything free market, the average price of rent will fall in the city. Because there are many people here who are paying very low rent who otherwise would not want to be in New York City if they would have to pay higher rent. And not because they don't like New York. And mainly, yeah, it could be because they don't even like living here. But they stay here because the rent is too good to give up, pretty much. You know, they could be much happier in another city. So, especially people that are paying very low rate of rent, it's very hard for them to give it up, even though they don't want to be here. So we have historically low vacancy rates. So the historically low. Okay. So the historic average vacancy rate in New York City over the past 100 years has kept steady at around 3%. There's no other city that can compare to this stat. Compared to the rest of the country, which has fluctuated between 6 and 10%. In a housing shortage, the winners are the property owners, who aren't subjected to massive fluctuations in vacancy rates that investors experience in other suburban markets. As of 2022, 68% of New York City residents are renters, compared to 36% nationwide. So 2/3 of the city needs an apartment to rent. If you want to be a landlord, this is the city to do it, right? So it sucks, but it sucks for a reason. That's also good. We also have diversity of industry. New York City has a robust job market of high-paying jobs, which do not depend on a single industry to thrive. Detroit, what happened in Detroit, right? They were overly dependent on the auto industry. That was the biggest paying job. San Francisco is very dependent on tech right now. So if something happens to tech, San Francisco is going down. You know, in New York City, we're not in the same.
I love New York City.
Who said?
Me.
Oh, okay.
I wasn't born here, wasn't raised here, but I'm a New Yorker.
Absolutely. So, you know, we have a lot of different sectors: financial services, tech, fashion, healthcare, professional services, retail, trade, manufacturing, and as the headquarters of many Fortune 500 companies, which are all very high-paying jobs, which means the sea of tenants won't run dry. Other cities which rely on single industries such as auto or tech are at constant risk of being in a boom and bust cycle, depending on the success of those industries at any given time. And we've seen that in many, many cities. Any questions? No? Okay. Okay. Now, hi. Now we're gonna get to the juicy part. We're gonna get to how do you figure out what investment is a good deal or not. So we're gonna talk about the cap rate that everyone hears, but some people aren't sure of how to do it.
The whole text is not fully visible. You
Maybe a little bit smaller.
Oh, yeah.
I'm gonna go out of.
piece of connection behind the TV?
No, I put it on a slide